I thought I knew my best friend better than anyone in the world, but I never realized one small moment would make me question everything I believed about us. My name is Noah Bennett, and for most of my life, Ryan Mitchell was the person I could always count on. We met years ago in Denver, Colorado, and somehow became the kind of friends people rarely find. We were not just friends who talked occasionally. We were the kind of friends who knew each other's routines, remembered small details, and could tell when something was wrong without asking. Ryan was the person who showed up when I needed support. He was confident, outgoing, and the type of person who made every room feel more energetic. He worked as a fitness coach, and people naturally trusted him because he always seemed comfortable in his own skin. I was different. I worked as a video editor, spending most of my days behind a computer, creating stories for other people while keeping much of my own life private. Ryan used to joke that I noticed everything except when someone was paying attention to me. I always laughed because he was probably right. Ryan was someone who saw details that I often ignored. Over the years, we built a friendship based on honesty and trust. We celebrated good moments together and supported each other during difficult ones. There was never a question about whether we would be there for each other. That was simply how things worked. Everyone around us knew we were close. Some people even joked that we acted more like brothers than friends. I never thought much about it because, to me, Ryan was just Ryan. He was my best friend. Nothing more complicated than that. At least, that was what I believed. Looking back, I think the biggest changes in life rarely arrive with a warning. They begin with small moments that seem ordinary at first. A conversation, a reaction, a feeling you do not understand immediately. For me, that moment happened during a simple night out with friends. Ryan and I were at a small restaurant downtown after a long week. We were laughing, talking about random things, and enjoying the kind of evening we had shared many times before. Then someone new joined our conversation. I noticed Ryan become quieter than usual. At first, I thought he was just tired, but then I saw the way he looked over whenever I was talking to someone else. It was not anger. It was not anything obvious. It was something I could not explain. A feeling I had never seen from him before. Later that night, Ryan made a comment that seemed casual, but something about it stayed in my mind. "You two seem to get along pretty well," he said. I smiled and asked, "Is that a bad thing?" He quickly laughed and said, "No, of course not." But the hesitation in his voice made me wonder. I had known Ryan for years. I knew his jokes, his habits, and his personality. Yet that small reaction felt unfamiliar. I did not know it then, but that was the first moment I started noticing the little things that would eventually change the way I understood our friendship. Because sometimes the biggest changes do not begin with a dramatic event. Sometimes they begin with a question you cannot stop thinking about. After that night, I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking everything. Ryan had always been my closest friend, and close friends notice things about each other. Maybe his comment was nothing. Maybe I was searching for meaning where there was none. That was what I told myself. But the strange part was that once I noticed the change, I started seeing more small moments that I could not ignore. Ryan was still the same person everyone knew. He was still confident, funny, and easy to talk to. But around me, there were moments when he seemed different. It was subtle, so subtle that I wondered if I was imagining it. A few days after our dinner downtown, Ryan and I met at our usual coffee shop in Denver. It was a place we had been going to for years, a quiet spot where we could talk about everything from work to random ideas. Normally, Ryan would spend most of the conversation telling stories and making jokes. That day, he seemed distracted. I asked if something was bothering him, but he quickly smiled and said everything was fine. I knew Ryan well enough to know when he was avoiding a topic. Still, I did not push. One thing I had always respected about our friendship was that we gave each other space. Later that week, I invited Ryan to a small gathering with some coworkers. I wanted him to meet a few people I had recently become friends with. The evening was relaxed and everyone was having a good time. I noticed Ryan was friendly with everyone, but whenever I started talking with someone new, he seemed to become quieter. It was not obvious enough for anyone else to notice, but I noticed. I had known him for too long. On the way home, Ryan asked me about one of the people I had been talking to. His question sounded casual, but there was a different feeling behind it. "So, are you two becoming friends?" he asked. I laughed and said, "Maybe." "Why?" Ryan shrugged. "No reason. I was just curious." Usually, I would have forgotten a conversation like that. But something about his reaction stayed with me. It was not because he asked. Friends ask questions. It was because of the way he asked. There was a hesitation that felt unfamiliar. For the first time, I started wondering if Ryan was experiencing something he did not fully understand himself. The thought felt strange because Ryan had always been the person who seemed to know exactly what he wanted. He gave advice to everyone else. He helped people solve problems. He was the person who always appeared certain. Seeing him confused about something made me realize there were parts of Ryan that even I had never seen. A few days later, we were watching a movie at my apartment when Ryan suddenly became quiet. I asked what he was thinking about and he smiled. "Nothing. Just life, I guess." I laughed and told him that sounded like something I would say. He smiled back, but I could tell there was more behind it. At that moment, I realized something important. Ryan was not just reacting differently. He was trying to understand something about himself. And whether I was ready for it or not, I was beginning to wonder the same thing. The more I tried to ignore the small changes in Ryan, the more I started noticing them. It was not because he suddenly became a different person. In many ways, he was still the same Ryan I had known for years. He still made jokes when things felt too serious. He still gave advice when I needed it. He still showed up whenever I needed someone. But there was a new uncertainty in him, and I could not figure out where it came from. A few weeks passed, and our normal routine continued. We worked, met for coffee, watched movies, and talked about everything happening in our lives. From the outside, nothing had changed. But between us, there was a feeling I could not describe. It was like an invisible question sitting in the background of every conversation. One Friday evening, Ryan and I went to a local park in Denver after work. It was something we had done many times before. We walked along the paths, talked about our plans for the future, and laughed about old memories. For a while, everything felt completely normal. Then Ryan asked me something unexpected. "Do you ever feel like people change without realizing it?" I looked at him and asked what he meant. He took a moment before answering. "I do not know. I guess I have been thinking about how we see ourselves compared to how other people see us." That answer surprised me because it sounded deeper than the usual conversations we had. Ryan was usually the person who kept things simple. Hearing him talk like that made me realize he was thinking about something important. I asked if something happened, but he just smiled and said, "Nothing happened. I am just thinking." I respected that answer, but I knew there was more behind it. Over the next few days, I started reflecting on our friendship. I thought about all the years we had spent together. I thought about how Ryan had always been protective of our friendship, how he always made time for me, and how he noticed things about my life that other people missed. At first, I believed that was just because we were close friends. But now I wondered if there was something else I had never noticed before. The hardest part was that I did not know what question I was trying to answer. I was not trying to label anything. I was not trying to force an explanation. I simply wanted to understand why something that had always felt simple suddenly felt complicated. One night, Ryan came over to my apartment after a long day. We ordered dinner and sat on the couch talking like we always did. Then he asked me about the people I had been spending time with recently. His tone was casual, but his expression changed when I mentioned someone I had recently met. "Are you interested in getting to know that person better?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment. "Why do you ask?" Ryan paused. "I do not know. I guess I am just curious." That answer stayed with me, because for the first time, I realized Ryan might not just be noticing changes in my life. He might be reacting to them. And maybe the biggest mystery was not what Ryan was feeling. Maybe it was whether he understood those feelings himself. After that night, I started paying closer attention to the moments I had previously ignored. Not because I wanted to find something that was not there, but because I realized our friendship had entered unfamiliar territory. Ryan and I had always been comfortable with each other, But now there were moments when silence felt different. There were pauses in conversations that made me wonder what he was thinking. There were small reactions that seemed to carry more meaning than they used to. The hardest part was that I did not know if Ryan noticed the same things. A few days later, we met at a small cafe near my apartment in Denver. It was one of those quiet afternoons where we usually talked about everything without thinking too much about it. Ryan was looking through his phone while I worked on a project, and for a while, everything felt normal. Then he suddenly asked, "Do you think people can misunderstand their own feelings?" I looked up from my laptop and smiled. That sounds like a very specific question. Ryan laughed, but it was not his usual confident laugh. It sounded more thoughtful. "Maybe it is," he said. I waited for him to explain, but he changed the subject. That moment stayed with me because Ryan was not someone who avoided conversations. If something bothered him, he usually talked about it. Seeing him hesitate made me realize he was dealing with something he was not ready to explain. Over the next few weeks, I noticed another change. Ryan started making more effort to spend time together. He would invite me to try new restaurants, ask about my day more often, and remember small details I mentioned weeks earlier. None of those things were unusual for Ryan because he had always been a good friend. But combined with everything else, they made me wonder if something deeper was happening. One evening, we were sitting in my apartment watching a basketball game. Ryan was usually focused during sports, but that night he seemed distracted. During a commercial break, he looked at me and asked, "Do you ever worry that things can change between two people without either person wanting them to?" I turned toward him. "Are you talking about us?" The question came out before I could think about it. For a few seconds, the room became quiet. Ryan looked surprised, almost like he had not expected me to say it directly. Then he smiled softly. "Maybe." That single word created a feeling I could not ignore. We had always been honest with each other, but suddenly honesty felt more complicated. I wanted to ask what he meant. I wanted to understand what was happening. But I also worried that asking too many questions could change something we had spent years building. Later that night, after Ryan left, I sat alone thinking about our friendship. I thought about every memory we shared, every time he supported me, and every moment when he made me feel like I was never facing life alone. Maybe the reason this felt so confusing was because Ryan was not just an important person in my life. He was one of the most important people in my life. The next morning, I received a message from him asking if we could talk later. It was a simple message, but somehow I knew it mattered. For the first time, I felt like we were approaching a conversation neither of us could avoid forever. And deep down, I knew that whatever happened next would change the way we saw each other. The message from Ryan stayed on my mind all morning. It was only a few words asking if we could talk later, but somehow it felt heavier than any long conversation we had ever shared. Ryan and I had always been able to talk about anything. Work problems, family stories, future plans, and random thoughts. That came up during ordinary days. But this felt different. Felt like there was something important waiting between us. That evening, Ryan came to my apartment in Denver, and for a while, neither of us knew how to begin. We sat in our usual spots, the same places where we had shared countless conversations before. The familiar setting somehow made the moment feel even more unusual because everything looked the same, yet something between us had changed. Finally, Ryan took a deep breath and looked at me. "I have been thinking a lot lately," he said. I nodded and waited. Ryan was quiet for a few seconds before continuing. "I think I have been confused about some things, and I do not really know how to explain it." Hearing that surprised me because Ryan was usually the person who always had the right words. "You do not have to explain everything perfectly," I told him. "Just tell me what you are feeling." He looked down for a moment and smiled slightly. "That is the problem. I am still trying to understand it myself." For the first time, I saw a side of Ryan that most people probably never noticed. Behind the confidence, the jokes, and the easy smile was someone who was genuinely trying to understand himself. He told me that he had started noticing how much he cared about the small details of my life. He noticed when I was stressed. He noticed when something made me happy. He noticed when I was quieter than usual. At first, he thought that was simply because we were close friends. But then he started questioning why certain moments affected him more than he expected. I listened carefully because I did not want to interrupt him. I knew this conversation was not easy for him. Ryan was not looking for an immediate answer. He was not asking me to solve anything. He was simply being honest about something he had been carrying alone. I appreciated that honesty more than anything else. After he finished talking, there was a quiet moment between us. I realized that I had been asking myself many of the same questions. I had also noticed the changes. I had also wondered why our friendship suddenly felt different. But I was afraid that saying it out loud would somehow change the relationship we had spent years building. Ryan, I said, I do not know exactly what this means either, but I do know that our friendship matters to me. He looked relieved, almost like he had been worried that honesty would make him lose something important. That night did not give us every answer. It did not magically make everything simple. Instead, it gave us something more valuable. It gave us the chance to stop pretending that nothing had changed. When Ryan left my apartment, I stood by the door for a moment thinking about how strange life could be. Sometimes the people who know us best are also the people who reveal parts of ourselves we never expected to discover. And for the first time, I understood that our story was no longer about ignoring the change. It was about learning what that change meant. After our conversation that night, things between Ryan and me felt different, but not in the way I feared. I expected everything to become uncomfortable. I expected every conversation to feel forced or every moment together to remind us that something had changed. Instead, something unexpected happened. We became more honest with each other. The pressure of pretending everything was exactly the same disappeared, and in its place came a deeper understanding. For the first time in years, we were not just relying on the history we shared. We were choosing to communicate in the present. A few weeks passed, and Ryan and I continued our normal routines. We still met for coffee, watched movies, and talked about our lives. But there was a new level of openness between us. Ryan started sharing thoughts he had kept to himself for a long time. He talked about how strange it felt to question something he thought he already understood. He admitted that he had spent years believing he knew exactly who he was and how he saw the world. I think I was so focused on having the right answers that I never allowed myself to ask new questions. He told me one afternoon while we sat at a small cafe near downtown Denver. I understood what he meant because I had experienced something similar. Sometimes we create a picture of ourselves and become afraid of anything that does not fit inside it. But life does not always follow the plans we create. That was something Ryan and I were learning together. One evening, we walked through the neighborhood where we had spent so many years building our friendship. The streets were quiet, and the familiar places around us reminded me of all the memories we had created. Ryan stopped for a moment and smiled. It is strange how one small thing can make you see everything differently. I asked him what he meant. He looked thoughtful before answering. I used to think change was something that happened because people made big decisions. But sometimes change happens because you finally notice what was already there. His words stayed with me because they explained exactly what had happened between us. Nothing appeared overnight. There was no single moment that created everything. It was a collection of small experiences that slowly revealed how important we had become to each other. Still, there was a question we had not completely answered. We knew our friendship had changed, but we were still learning what that meant. We both understood that honesty was important, but honesty also required patience. Neither of us wanted to rush into something we did not fully understand. One night, before Ryan left my apartment, he paused near the door and looked back at me. "Thank you for listening," he said. "I know this has not been easy to explain." I smiled and told him that he did not have to have every answer right away. "We have always figured things out together," I said. "I do not think that needs to change." After he left, I realized something important. The biggest challenge was never the change itself. The challenge was accepting that something meaningful could grow from an unexpected place. Ryan had entered my life as my best friend, and now I was beginning to understand that the most important relationships are not always the ones we plan. Sometimes they are the ones that quietly become impossible to imagine living without. The weeks after our conversation changed the way Ryan and I understood our friendship. We were still the same two people who laughed at the same jokes, shared the same memories, and spent time together like we always had. But there was a new honesty between us that made every conversation feel more meaningful. We no longer avoided difficult topics, and we no longer pretended that nothing had changed. Instead, we allowed ourselves to be patient and understand what was happening one step at a time. Still, there were moments when uncertainty returned. Even though Ryan had opened up to me, I knew he was still trying to understand his own thoughts and feelings. I could see that he was afraid of making a mistake. Ryan had always been someone who appeared certain about everything, so watching him question something important in his life was completely different from the person I thought I knew. One afternoon, we sat outside a coffee shop in Denver, enjoying the warm weather and talking about the future. Ryan looked at me and said, "I think the hardest part is realizing that life does not always fit into the categories we create." I nodded because I understood exactly what he meant. People often spend years trying to define themselves, but sometimes real life introduces experiences that challenge those definitions. That does not mean something is wrong. It simply means we are still learning. Ryan told me that he was worried about losing the friendship we had built. He said that our connection meant too much to him to risk damaging it. Hearing that made me realize we shared the same fear. I had also wondered if being honest would somehow take away the comfort we had always found in each other. "Ryan," I said, "the reason our friendship has lasted this long is because we trust each other. I do not think honesty is what will break that." He smiled because I knew those words gave him some comfort. But even after that conversation, we both knew there were still things we had not fully figured out. Sometimes understanding yourself takes time. Sometimes the most important answers do not arrive immediately. They appear through conversations, experiences, and moments when you allow yourself to be open. A few days later, Ryan invited me to join him for a walk near one of our favorite places in the city. As we walked, he talked about how much his perspective had changed. "I used to think knowing yourself meant having everything planned out," he said. "Now I think it means being willing to learn something new about yourself." I smiled because that sounded like the Ryan I had always known, but also a version of him I had never seen before. Someone who was not afraid to admit uncertainty. Someone who was willing to grow. That night, when I returned home, I thought about how different everything felt compared to the beginning. The friendship I valued had not disappeared. It had become deeper because we finally allowed ourselves to be honest. But I also knew that the next step would be the hardest one. Understanding a feeling was one thing. Deciding what to do with that understanding was something completely different. After everything Ryan and I had shared, I started to understand that the most important changes in life are not always the ones that happen suddenly. Sometimes they happen quietly, through conversations that slowly change the way two people see each other. That was what happened with us. We were no longer pretending that nothing had changed, but we were also not rushing to define something we were still learning to understand. We were simply allowing ourselves to be honest. For the first time in a long time, Ryan seemed more comfortable with himself. The uncertainty that once made him hesitate began to turn into acceptance. He was still the same person who made everyone laugh and brought energy into every room, but now he was also someone who allowed himself to be thoughtful and open. I realized that the biggest difference was not in how Ryan treated me. It was in how he treated himself. He stopped trying to force every feeling into a simple explanation. He started accepting that people can discover new things about themselves at any point in life. One weekend, Ryan and I took a short drive outside Denver to get away from our usual routine. We stopped at a small mountain town, walked around local shops, and enjoyed a slower day away from our busy schedules. It reminded me of the early years of our friendship when we could spend hours talking about nothing and everything at the same time. While we sat outside a small cafe, Ryan looked across the table and smiled. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if we never became friends?" he asked. I laughed and told him I could not imagine it. Ryan nodded. "Me neither. That is why I do not want fear to decide what happens next." His words stayed with me because they showed how much he had grown. The Ryan I first met always wanted to have a clear plan. He wanted to know the next step before moving forward. But now he understood that some of the most meaningful parts of life come from accepting uncertainty. I also had to be honest with myself. For a long time, I focused on understanding Ryan's thoughts, but I did not spend enough time thinking about my own. I had always described him as my best friend, but that description no longer felt complete. Ryan was someone who challenged me, supported me, and helped me see parts of myself I had ignored. He was someone who made ordinary moments feel important. That realization was both comforting and overwhelming. A few days later, Ryan and I had another conversation at my apartment. This time it felt different. There was less fear and more understanding. We talked about how much our friendship meant to us and how neither of us wanted to lose the foundation we had built over the years. Ryan smiled and said, "Maybe the reason we are able to talk about this is because what we have was always real." I agreed. That night, after Ryan left, I stood near the door for a moment and thought about everything that had happened. A simple friendship had become a journey of self-discovery for both of us. We were not trying to change the past. We were simply learning how to move forward with honesty. And for the first time, I felt ready for whatever conversation came next. Looking back at everything that happened between Ryan and me, I realized the biggest lesson was not about finding a perfect answer. It was about understanding that some connections are valuable because they challenge us to grow. When Ryan first became my best friend, I never imagined that our friendship would lead us into conversations about identity, trust, and the parts of ourselves we rarely share with anyone else. But life has a way of bringing unexpected moments that reveal who we truly are. Months after our first difficult conversation, things between Ryan and me felt more natural than ever. We did not need to pretend that nothing had changed, and we did not need to force every moment into a definition. We simply appreciated the trust we had built. Ryan was still the same person who made me laugh when I needed it most. He was still the person who encouraged me when I doubted myself. But now there was a deeper understanding between us. We had learned that honesty did not have to destroy something meaningful. Sometimes honesty was the reason something meaningful became stronger. One evening, Ryan and I sat outside my apartment building in Denver, remembering how different everything had been at the beginning. We talked about the years we had known each other and the moments that shaped our friendship. Ryan smiled and said, "It is funny how one small change can make you look back at everything differently." I agreed because that was exactly how I felt. The moments that once seemed ordinary became important when I looked back at them. The conversations, the support, the times when Ryan noticed things about me that I did not even notice about myself. Those moments had always been there. We simply understood them differently now. Ryan told me that one of the most important things he learned was that people are always growing. He said he used to think knowing himself meant having a complete understanding of who he was. Now he believed that knowing yourself meant being open to discovering new things along the way. I thought that was a powerful idea because I had learned something similar. I spent so much time trying to understand what was changing between us that I almost forgot to appreciate how much the journey had changed me. Ryan had taught me to be more open. He had shown me that unexpected experiences can become some of the most meaningful parts of life. Our story was never about one single moment. It was about hundreds of small moments that slowly built trust and understanding. It was about two people who were willing to listen, learn, and accept that life does not always follow the path we imagine. Today, when I think about Ryan, I do not just think about the unexpected changes that brought us here. I think about the friendship that gave us the courage to be honest. I think about how one person can enter your life and quietly change the way you see yourself. Ryan was my best friend, but he was also a reminder that the most important connections are often the ones we never see coming. And sometimes, the greatest changes begin with simply being willing to understand someone a little more deeply.